In your kit, you'll find 4 squares that are about 3.5 inches. They are plain filler blocks, so all you need to do is trim them down to 2.5 inches. I have a Creative Grids ruler here, a 6.5 inch one. If you're using Creative Grids, make sure when you're trimming, you're looking to see whether it doesn't have the 1/2 inch on the edge or it does. So, for my 2.5 inches, I can just take an edge off, and one way for trimming up is to use a mat that is on basically a Lazy Susan, so I can just twist the mat without lifting my ruler. And then flip the ruler around, line it up on the 2.5 inch mark here. Trim and trim. So all 4 of those you're just trimming down to the 2.5 inches. Also in your kit you will find 10 3.5 by 5.5 rectangles, and these are also filler blocks, and they get cut down to 2.5 by 4.5. So if you don't have a rotating mat, if you have a smaller one, then you can trim using that and just pick it up and turn it around or slide it. And if you bump it like I did, then the edge is probably not the ideal thing to line up with, so I'll line up with one of the lines on the ruler. And then, okay, I said 2.5 by 4.5. So there I have it lined up on the 4.5 line and on the 2.5 line. I know we usually say don't cut across yourself, but I do sometimes. There's the 2.5 by 4.5. If you don't have a small mat, but you do have a space where you can walk around the mat, then that's another option. You can just move around your square while you cut it. But if you don't have that option either, then you can start flipping your actual fabric piece. So I flipped it around, and I line up my 2.5 line and my 4.5. So those are 3 ways to trim down your squares. So go ahead and trim down all 10 of those. In the kit are also 22 4-inch squares. Now the pattern says to cut those at 3 inches. You can if you want to, but it's not really necessary. What we're going to do with these squares is draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner. And you can use anything to draw that line, but my marking tool of preference right now is a Frixion pen. The cool thing about this pen is that after you are finished with the marks, all you have to do is apply heat. And you see I wrote my name here, and the marks disappear. Now just a word of caution, the marks will come back if the item gets below 14 degrees. Now, most of the time that's not going to make any difference. When we're marking the diagonal lines like this, we're cutting on those lines eventually, so they're not going to show. I really like this pen for marking hand embroidery, and I'm going over those lines anyway. It's just if I make a mistake while I'm tracing a pattern, then that mark is not there forever like with a permanent pen. However, I don't use it on the front of quilts to mark quilting designs. If by some chance you shipped this quilt after it was finished and it sat in a truck somewhere overnight, or somebody left it in their car overnight somewhere where it's really cold, then those black marks or red marks or whatever color pen you have would come back. Now the nice thing is all you have to do is apply heat and they'll go away again. Anyway, you can mark these lines with a pencil if you want to. I just like my Frixion pen. So to do that, I just need a straight edge, point to point. If you want to be really particular, then you can line up your 45-degree line with one side of the square and draw. If you're leaving these at 4 inches, then you have a lot to trim down later. So the next thing I'm going to do is take these to my sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch from each side of the line. Before I went off to sew, I forgot to mention a couple of things. You only need to mark the diagonal line on 11 of the 22 blocks, and then you're going to pair each of those marked blocks with one of the unmarked blocks, and they will go right sides together to sew them together. Now at the sewing machine, I like to chain piece, and all that means is that I'm feeding one piece in right after the other without cutting the threads. So here I stitched a 1/4 inch away from the line that I marked, put in the next piece, and just kept going. When I got to the other end, all I did was flip my chain around and come back on the other side. So now I have a 1/4 inch from both sides. Now in quilting, a 1/4 inch seam allowance is important. If you went ahead and left your squares 4 inches rather than cutting them down to 3, in this block, that 1/4 inch is not as critical, but you might as well practice it so that you get it right later on. Now once you have them all sewn together, for all intents and purposes, you have 2 half-square triangle units sewn together, one on that side and one on that side. So now all you need to do is cut them apart on the line. If you have a lot of these done and you just want to sit down and do some brainless work, you could sit and do it while you're watching TV using scissors. Or if you just want to crank them out, then grab your rotary cutter and a ruler and slice them apart. It doesn't matter if you're exactly on that line. It's nice to keep a consistent seam allowance. Now the next thing we're going to do, and I need to heat the iron up, is we're going to press them. When I press, I can just show you with a cold iron. I first press down on top of the seam to set the seam. Then, if I have a light side versus a dark side, I usually want to press toward the dark. In that case, my dark would be on top, and all I do is flip that top triangle over, and you can sort of finger press, and then it is an up and down motion with your iron, not sliding and pushing, because if you do that, you'll stretch it. So rather than you watching me press all these, I'm going to go press off camera, and I'll be back to show you how to trim up these blocks. Okay, I've pressed my half-square triangle unit. The seam goes to one side, and now I'm ready to trim it up. And I'm going to trim it up with these Bloc-Loc rulers, which come in several different sizes. This one happens to be a 4.5 inch. What's special about them is they have a groove cut in the bottom that locks on to the seam allowance on the block. So, because I left this at 4 inches when I was making my marking, I have more than enough for trimming down, but I need to cut these down to 2.5 inch squares. So when I'm using the Bloc-Loc, I want to make sure, if this was smaller, that I have some fabric sticking out beyond the 2.5 inch line down here. When I do, I know that I do, then I can go ahead and trim. And notice this locks on here. It'll slide up and down the seam, but it doesn't slip or rock when I'm cutting. So I have it locked on the seam. I'm doing my first trim. And now, rather than moving the ruler or the mat, I can just put my fingers down on the ruler and twist. And because the numbers go both ways on this ruler, I can just slide it down the seam until I get my lines lined up on the 2.5 inch mark here and the 2.5 inch mark here, and cut. This makes for an extremely accurate block, and you can do it really quick.